The results of an independent autopsy are back for a Georgia man whose family says he was eaten alive by insects. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Now, the autopsy was paid for by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, and the autopsy cites neglect. And it goes on to claim that Thompson died from untreated schizophrenia, in addition to dehydration, malnutrition, and severe insect infestation, which included lice and bed bugs. The 35-year-old was found dead in a filthy Fulton County Jail cell in the psychiatric ward back in September of 2022. Let's bring in attorney and NAACP president for the state of Georgia, Gerald Griggs. Attorney Griggs, thank you so much for being with us. Now, you have called for the immediate filing of charges against any and everyone connected to Mr. Thompson's death. Let's name them. Who do you think should be held responsible?
I think the chief jailer and all the jail staff, clearly he was in severe neglect. He had been living in atrocious conditions with bed bug bites and lice infestations on his body and in his cell. And we know he was there for at least 93 days. So it seems to me clear case of criminal negligence, and somebody needs to be held accountable, starting with the jail staff.
Yeah. Speaking of that staff, the chief jailer and then 2 assistant jailers have resigned at the request of the sheriff there. But the resignation's not enough, right? What kind of charges do you think that they should be looking at?
Well, I think that easily you have some sort of homicide, whether it's voluntary or involuntary homicide. But I'm glad to see that the Fulton County District Attorney's Office has opened an investigation and looking at potential charges, but something needs to be done immediately. Mr. Thompson should have never been living in those type of conditions. We wouldn't allow an animal to live in those type of conditions, but now we have citizens that are merely detained, alleged to have committed a crime, that are living in deplorable third world type conditions in the city that's known for civil rights.
It's a really important distinction that you just said there. And of course, nobody convicted or otherwise should be living in deplorable conditions like are being reported here for Mr. Thompson. But this was not a convicted individual. This was somebody who enjoyed the presumption of innocence, as all Americans do, up and until there is a conviction. And yet he was in these conditions for over 90 days. Add the compounding, I believe, vulnerability of his mental health condition, being a diagnosed schizophrenic, and this all just becomes unconscionable, severe Eighth Amendment violations to the Constitution and things like that. Attorney Griggs, talk about what happens when there are competing autopsy findings. We know that the very first autopsy came back, quote, undetermined, but this second independent autopsy paid for by Colin Kaepernick has said homicide. What, from a legal standpoint, what does a prosecutor do when there's 2 determinations?
Well, now you have dueling experts, and it makes it more difficult for a prosecutor to, observe the case and determine which route it should go. But I think based on the latest autopsy, you clearly have some sort of homicide case, so you can proceed now that you have an expert that will agree with that legal theory. But I do agree it's difficult for a prosecutor when you have dueling experts, and you may need a second independent autopsy to make sure you confirm what the second autopsy had. So you might need a third one.
Yeah, and that determination of death by homicide is so important, as we know, when you are trying to get a conviction. Now, the medical review showed that there was a lack of medication in Mr. Thompson's system, so he was not being properly treated for his very severe mental health condition. I know that you and your office have been in response to all the political leadership in the state of Georgia going up to the governor. Any response yet?
No response yet. And, Georgia has a serious mental health crisis that's happening. It was exacerbated by the pandemic. And it's a shame that our leading mental health facilities are jails and prisons because we are severely underfunded. So we've reached out to the governor's office. Of course, we're in contact with the sheriff's office, but there needs to be a full funding of our mental health facilities here in Georgia. So it's no longer the criminal justice system that is acting as the backstop for providing health. And of course, we have the closure of numerous hospitals around the state. So we have a mental health crisis that's exacerbated by the public health crisis.
Indeed. And, you know, Attorney Griggs, I understand better than most, because here in New York City, we're looking at the same thing, exactly as what you said. And many are saying that our lack of funding and facilities and resources for mental health is probably a large reason that Mr. Jordan Neely is dead right now, being choked to death on a New York City subway, as I'm sure you're aware. We know that these issues have to be dealt with holistically. I know here in New York City, Mayor Eric Adams is being rightfully held to the fire. Let's talk about the mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, Andre Dinkins and his office, as well as going up to the state level leadership in government. How important is the mayor's office in this work?
Well, in this particular case, it doesn't involve the city government, even though Atlanta does have a serious issue with police accountability as well as mental health funding. But this case is not indicative of Mayor Dinkins. What it is indicative of the Fulton County Commission and the underfunding and allowing the dilapidation of the jail. So the highest level, of course, would be the governor, and then next would be the county commission and the county chair. And we do know that the sheriff on numerous occasions has asked for more funding to secure the jail and to make sure that the jail conditions are appropriate. But we believe that at this particular point, it's reached a crisis level that something needs to be done. More than just voluntary resignations, people need to be held accountable. The conditions need to be fixed immediately because, again, most of the individuals in the Fulton County Detention Center are pretrial detainees, and Mr. Thompson was merely there for a misdemeanor with a $2,500 bond, so he should have never been treated like this.
Indeed, and it ultimately became a death sentence for him. Attorney Gerald Griggs, I want you to stay with me. I've got a lot more I want to unpack with you around the death of Mr. Lashawn Thompson after the break. Stay with us. You're watching The Griot.
I told myself I'm not gonna be no deadbeat father. Like, for me to be a deadbeat father, I gotta be dead, and somebody gotta beat me up for me to be a deadbeat. I'm not letting that happen.
Coming in June, watch Alexander Charles Jr. in Daddy Don't Go on The Griot. Coming in June, watch Hugh Jackman and Halle Berry in Swordfish, right here on The Griot.